Howdy, all you delicious people. I'm here today to review Son of the Mask. So, I don't know exactly why I'm even going into this review. Not that this movie is that bad. I'm just like, how is it that I got to this point? I remember I had reviewed The Mask 1994, and then I decided, you know what? How about I finally just review the sequel? I have never fully fledgedly watched the full entire sequel before. I think I saw like bits and pieces and stuff like that, just like little tiny bits of it, but I've never fully fledgedly watched this film. And so, going into this movie, in all honesty, I thought that this movie was. It has a very goofy story. It has a lot of Looney Tunish like things to it, which immediately I'm just like, why not have just made this an animated film? Why did you have to make this live action? Like, if anything, there's so many Looney Tunish special effects things going on in this movie that it kind of has me thinking, like, why wasn't somebody in an actual mask through a bulk of this movie instead of it being more carried upon uh, a baby throughout this entire film? Like, this entire film relies on a baby. I'm like, huh? And yeah, so in all actuality, we really, I think within this film, I think that there were way too many cooks in the kitchen. Like, I think so many people wanted to do so many things in this movie. Like, we had so many people with so many ideas. Like, they had, like, I think there was too much writing going on. Like, so really, like, if this movie would have been really tied to really Otis getting the mask and the baby being what it is in this movie, I honestly think that I would not have cared about this film whatsoever. I honestly think the parts where Jamie Kennedy actually has the mask on actually probably does save the film much more so than hurt it. And I know some people might feel differently. Really, I thought that this film was trying to honestly do way too much. I feel like this movie was doing way too much, but also I thought that this movie, like, having actually literally Loki come down to Earth to just try to stop whoever the mask wearer is in this movie, I was like, okay, like that isn't like I would have been happy if like Thor would have came down here and it would have been like bizarre-ish Thor, but when looking at it, Thor is also like a Marvel character and like there's so many probably like copyrights and all kinds of things you have like so much red tape with that character. Uh really I thought also like Loki, like especially the hair looks like so bizarre, and like his outfit looks so weird. Um, like that character was just kind of like, how outlandish could we make this character? And that's where the outlandish thing goes. Going into this movie, I thought there were fun moments. Let's be honest, there were fun moments. I cannot say that there weren't fun moments in this movie. Basically, when the baby ends up saying the words "mother" or "mom" or whatever, to where then he eventually is to go on like "mother," like that actually was funny to me. I actually thought that that was funny. Uh, we really have it to where reasonably this honestly just becomes like one of those kind of babysitter like movies where you end up having like the terror of Tim's character kind of winning you over on this film, like the terror that Tim is to be in, and also like the guy has barely slept for a numerous amount of days, and so like we have it to where this guy is like trying to draw and can't, trying to realize that he's going to have to pitch a show to somebody and he can't because he is so exhausted and or tired. So going into this film, really really I did really find it enjoyable, but I also like there was a lot of times where I was just kind of like, yeah, it's yeah, it's a weird movie. It's a odd film. But when looking at it, I've seen any number of films. Is this as good as the original? I would honestly say no, just because in all actuality, I like the original because it feels more in the realm of a comic book or a superhero like film, where this movie isn't anything like that at all. It's basically just like, well, yeah, like that Jim Carrey thing was a great film, and we're not going to copy and paste over that. I get that. But really, you have it too where there isn't enough, like, real mask things that I'm just like, wow, like this won me over because of this mask thing. Really, like none of this really just like won me over as far as the terror on Tim's face when things would pop off. That's the only thing that won me over. I didn't care about anything else after that or in between that because really I was just kind of just like, oh, this is the story? Okay. All right. Great. Yeah. But if anything, also, some people might have gotten won over by this movie, and good for you. Uh, like, to me, I would never recommend this movie because it's a fairly goofy film, and some people would go into this and be like, you watched this film? Why? This movie is just like, or whatever, however they feel about it. Um, I just thought there were bits and pieces in this movie that I thought were fun, but overall, uh, I'm just glad that they did not make a franchise out of this. Could they like trickled this thing out, try to like continue to make money off this? Again, I would honestly say The Mask needs to uh, really just go back to the comic book material that actually I think a lot more people are won over by than the actual Jim Carrey mask thing itself. Like, I think a lot of people would immediately say, man, if they're going to do The Mask reboot, they should actually adapt it from the comic books instead of going the route of making another kind of probably Jim Carrey movie, because I'm sure that's what they're probably thinking that they should do. So, with that said, I'm going to go out of my way to go into spoiler territory within this film, just because reasonably, I don't want to repeat myself by saying anything cryptic wise. So it is spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time again to spoil this movie. So we immediately have it to where we end up having Tanya and Tim. So Tanya and Tim are seemingly contemplating quite possibly having a child. It seems that Tim is a person that is trying to get pitches out there for him to be able to get a show going. And it seems that Tim is very hesitant about getting a child just because he still wants his freedom. But also, like, Tim also just wants to, like, be able to say that he is somebody and he hasn't made it there yet. And so we end up having to where Tim is, like, feeling the pressure from Tanya, just like, dude, I want to start my family now. And Tim is like, well, yeah, but I haven't gotten anywhere with my career yet, and I want to be able to get somewhere with my career, and then like have me be a someone to my child that is coming. So we end up having Tim, who ends up having a nightmare that Tanya is delivering a baby, and then it becomes more than one baby, and then it becomes like 8 different babies. And we end up having a visual of all these babies having bizarrely vampire teeth. And Tim is like, oh my god, they're sucking me dry, kind of thing. And so we end up having it to where eventually Tim is to go on and showcase to us that it seems that he is a mascot within the company that he is at. He seems that he ends up wearing a turtle costume to work, so that way he can uh, have people go on tours with him as this turtle character. So we end up eventually having Tim's character was eventually going on lunch with one of his coworkers. I think his name is George, and so we end up having Tim, who's like, you know what, like, hey, like this guy is an animator, and you know what, I should probably go over there and talk to him. And of course, his coworker says, like, well, yeah, sure, you should go ahead and talk to him. And Tim is like, well, yeah, maybe I should. Maybe I should tell him everything. Maybe I should tell him what for and all kinds of stuff. And we end up having his friend George that's on. Are you insane? So we end up having Tim, who is going over to pitch his show to this superior of his, which is uh, heck if I know the actual guy's name. Um, yeah, I won't be able to find it. It'll take forever. Uh, yeah, his superior. And so I know he's a stand-up comedian. I've seen some of his stuff, but I heaven forbid actually know his character name in this movie. So we end up having it to where eventually we also seem to have Loki that is in the surface world. We end up having it to where Loki ends up going to a museum where we end up having uh, Bill Nye or Ben Nye as Dr. Nerman, who is going over the exhibits, and eventually he ends up going to the mask, talking about how it gives anybody who wears it the power and ability of Loki. And so we end up having Ben Stein going on about what he thinks had happened with Loki. And eventually we end up having Loki, who is like, that's not what happened at all. And so we end up having Loki, who ends up all of a sudden going in and just basically taking the Loki mask for himself. And eventually there's a bunch of security guards that appear. And so we end up having Loki, who ends up kind of taking his hands and turning them into guns. And he starts like shooting up all around these security guards. And we end up having him saying like, well, thanks for dropping by. And they're like, dropping? And he's like, bye. And then we end up having the floor for the security guards fall through, and then of course the security guards fall through. So we end up having Loki, who is to take this mask, and we end up finding out the mask isn't actually a real, legit, uh, like actual mask. We end up finding out that the mask is actually made from Taiwan, and so we end up having it to where Ben Stein is to basically have the front of his head taken off of his head and placed into this exhibit, because really the mask is just a facade or fake. So we end up having it to be where Ben Stein's mat or face is just as good as this actual mask. So we go on to have Odin, who is talking to Loki from the skies. And so we end up having Odin telling Loki that he needs to find this mask and find it soon, or Odin's eventually going to take every power away from Loki. So we end up having it to where we end up having so Otis is to eventually get and find the mask. It seems like it's eventually coming from some water source somewhere. So Otis ends up grabbing the mask. And so we eventually have it to where seemingly the mask is around the house. And so we end up eventually having Jamie, who is to like play with his dog and realize this mask exists. So we end up having Jamie, who is to have to forcibly go to this Halloween party, and so he is to just play a werewolf victim because he doesn't know what the heck else to wear. And so we end up having Tanya noticing that there is a mask here for Tim to wear, and so we end up having Tim saying like, "Well, you know what? Like this is not a great mask, but you know what? Like maybe this is just the only thing that I'm going to be able to wear." So we have it to where Tim ends up putting on the mask as soon as he gets to the party, and that mask ends up turning him into the mask. And so we end up having Tim, who ends up arriving at this party, to eventually start dancing around with some of these women, or really just like we end up having one girl who seems to be wearing a little bit too less of a piece of clothing, and so we end up having uh, the mask going and making a mummification of this woman, and then eventually he unmummifies her to eventually have seemingly this girl land in the arms of George, Tim's coworker. So we eventually go on to have the mask just start to perform this, of course, dance number, because it seems that this party is dead just because there like isn't a good enough like song number in here, and so we end up having the mask go up there and very much kind of jazz up this song that people are singing, and kind of makes people much more excited about this party, more pumping, more whatever. And so we eventually end up having, eventually after this party is over, we end up having the mask going and seducing Tanya, to eventually find out the very next day that it seems that Tanya is pregnant. So we end up having it to where Tanya is to eventually go and have an ultrasound being done, and we end up finding out that the baby is bizarrely doing all kinds of things in Tanya's body, to where we end up seeing like the baby with like a sombrero and two maracas and all kinds of things in this girl's wound, which I thought was kind of hilarious. The kind of the baffledness of Tim trying to understand what is going on with this child in this womb. So we eventually have said child who ends up getting delivered. And so we end up having Tim, who is now going to have to forcibly watch over his child. And so we end up having it uh, to where Tim is slowly but surely starting to see some goofy things happen with his son, with Alvy. So we end up having it to where Alvy is to really start to do one thing, that is to basically, while Tim is calling Tanya, we end up having it to where eventually Alvy is to eventually say the words mama or mother or mom. And so we end up having it to where Tim is desperately asking for Alvy to say, well, yeah, but could you say dada? Like, can you say dad? And so we end up having it to where Alvy ends up saying mother. To where eventually we end up having, of course, Tim still eventually asking his child to say, like, can you say daddy? and we end up having it to where the baby ends up saying like mother in like some other kind of language or Spanish or something. So we eventually have it to where uh, Jamie is to give up the mask, and so we end up having it to where eventually Otis is to eventually get the mask and start to try and win over the affections of, I guess, Tim by trying to destroy Alvy. So we end up having it to where it seems that the baby and the dog are kind of working against one another. It seems like when one person or one dog or one person thinks that they are going to get one another, actually it is the real legitimate opposite, that reasonably we end up having it to where at first like the dog is giving Alvy a dynamite piece, but we end up having a Alvy who ends up eating the dynamite piece and ends up like making a sound of an explosion. So we end up having Alvy who ends up giving Otis a bone, and that bone has a detonation piece on it as well, and so. Uh, but eventually, we end up having it to where Tim eventually is to see that his son has a power of sorts, because we end up having Alvy who ends up watching some Warner Brothers cartoon where we end up having the dancing frog. And so we end up having eventually, while Tim is desperately trying to draw sketches, we end up having, of course, Alvy who ends up busting into this frog like dance, and we end up having Tim who's going like, "What the heck is going on? Oh my God, my son is doing this! How is this possible?" And then eventually we end up having it to where Tim is consistently showing his powers, and we end up having Alvy who ends up consistently showing his powers to Tim, and Tim is freaking out now. We end up having to where at first Tim maybe thinks like he had just not been sleeping, but instead we end up having it to where Tim thinks that his child or his son has superpowers, and like he's losing his mind. So we end up eventually having it to where, excuse me, eventually Tim is to try to have Alvy show his powers to his neighbors or to like friends of his or strangers or whatever, to see if this person has to showcase that he's not the only one that sees this baby having superpowers. So we eventually have it to where Loki is to find out that it seems whoever had worn the mask had created a child. And so not only Loki has to go and find where the mask is, but then also Loki has to figure out which baby it is that is the one who was born from a person of the mask. So I'm going to pause here for a second. All right. So we go along here, and eventually we have Loki who is going from baby to baby to baby to baby. And so we eventually have it to where eventually Loki is to make it to Tim's home, and we end up having it to where Loki kind of assumes that this kid isn't the one either. But then eventually we end up having it to where Tim is going and just saying like, "Hey man, like go ahead, check on my child, like see if it's gonna do anything for you." And so we end up having Loki who ends up leaving, to where we end up having Tim who ends up going on and is like, "Dude, like I can't handle this kid anymore. Like I have to go and like take him to a doctor or something. Like there is something wrong with this kid and I need to get him checked out." So we go on to have Tim, who is to put Alvy in his car and basically tell him it's like, well, hopefully you don't do anything exorcist like. And so we end up having the baby completely 100% or 360 turning his head around, and then eventually he ends up like power vomiting all over the windshield of his car, and then we end up having Loki who's like, wait a minute, like maybe this is the kid that we thought it was going to be, like maybe like this is it. And so we end up having Loki, who ends up being, of course, too late, to where Odin ends up getting rid of all of Loki's powers, and then eventually Loki has to make a bargain with Odin to say, hey, like, I found the kid, like, he's right here, and so all I need is for you to give me back my power, and I will make up for all this. So we end up having it to where Loki eventually takes the kid and eventually forces Tim to eventually go and get the mask. We end up finding out that the mask is with Otis, and Otis is trying to win over some other dog. So we end up having eventually Tim trying to figure out exactly where his dog is. Of course, he knows exactly where it is because other dogs. So we end up having it to where eventually Tim is to eventually try to negotiate with the dog to just be like, hey man, like I need to go and protect my my kid, and so I need to get this mask from you, Otis. And plus, also, we end up having this bizarrish, like, Otis is almost kind of like the child of this movie to really Tim, anyways. And so, bizarrely, like, the dog is kind of like Alvy's brother, which is just weird. But, anyways, so we go on to have Tim get the mask and make his way to Loki. So we end up deciding that, or we end up going along to eventually have this trade off. And so we end up having Tim, who ends up giving Loki the mask, and Loki decides to not give up the child. And so eventually we end up having Jamie, who ends up getting the mask back and putting it on, and now having to fight Loki and do these kind of all weird and wild like car race like things and all kinds of bizarreness. But eventually this leads to uh, Loki just deciding, well, hey, how about we just let the baby decide? If he comes to me, who is Loki, then that'll be the end of it. But if the baby does go to its father, then I will just have to just let that be. So we end up having eventually Jamie ending up taking off the mask and trying to do a heartfelt speech that gets his baby to come to him. And so we end up having it to where Odin ends up showing up literally on Earth. And so we eventually have it to where Odin just is so disappointed of Loki, and that basically Loki is just really up empty-handed yet again. And so we end up having Tim's character, who gives Odin the mask and is trying to talk to both Loki and Odin about, like, hey, like, how about you really just be a family, and how about you actually just realize how much you really do love one another, even with all the stuff that you guys do to hurt one another or whatever. So we end up having both Odin and Loki when deciding to teleport off together, and so we end up having it to where Loki is like, well, hey, maybe I can like kind of mend some fences with you and Mom, Odin, and Odin's like, I wouldn't go that far. So we end up going along and eventually having it to where it seems that really Tim is making a whole animated show basically about like his life, how it seems like he has a goofy dog and a very animated like baby, and so we basically just have him make money off the experiences that he has already had. And so that's when we end up having them just making a show about that. And so we end up having Tanya, who ends up mentioning to Tim, it's like, well, hey, it seems that eventually you're going to need to add another cast member to that show. And Tim is like, well, hey, like, that sounds great. Who is it? And she's like, well, yeah, I'm pregnant again. I'm like, oh, so that's the way of which that this movie tends to end. Um, Really, I kind of tried to rush through this one just because who knows what the interest is in this movie. But also, like, some people, like, might have certain kind of consensuses of this film. Some people might have said that this is stupid or garbage or whatever. Some people might have just been like, I didn't understand why you even went and reviewed this, which is perfectly okay. Because at the end of the day, I just also just need content. So the more content, the merrier. Plus, also, some people might actually have liked this movie, and not enough to say that there should have garnered a sequel to this movie, but some people might just like this movie. Some people might just think that it's fun, even though it has none of the vibes of the original Jim Carrey film, which a lot of people do love. So, with that said, I am going to get out of here. Bye, everybody. Bye, everybody.